Hello, Rebels. Welcome to The Base, the place where we try and figure out what's wrong with California and how to put it right. Today, we're going to dive straight into our guest, Pete Peterson. He's someone I've known for a while, and I'm really excited to hear what he's got to say today because he's been looking at California politics, the shifting alliances and positions of the different parties and candidates and so on for a long time. Obviously, there's a lot going on in California politics right now, and I think it'd just be really interesting for us to hear from Pete how we got to this moment. You know, what led up to the situation we're in today. That's what I'd love to hear from him about. Pete, it's great to see you. Could you just quickly tell us a little bit about yourself? Just introduce yourself so that those listening who may not have come across you and your work before just have some sense of where you're coming from.
Sure. Well, it's great to be back with you, Steve. I am the very grateful Dean of Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Public Policy. I'm coming to you here from the conference room on our Malibu, California campus. Have been involved in politics and policy of one way, shape, or form here in California for about 15 years. Back in 2014, I ran for a statewide office for California Secretary of State. As I often quip, I ran statewide as a Republican here in California, which is why I'm now Dean of a policy school. But do a lot of work around the state, advising, consulting with local and state government agencies.
So let's just jump straight into it. One thing that Kristen and I hear, one thing that comes up a lot as we have these conversations about different issues, whether that is the public state of public schools and the lack of accountability around that, energy policy, the drought and water policy, almost every issue. At some point in the conversation, we get to this moment where either we or one of our guests says, well, the problem is it's just a one-party state. And so nothing's going to happen. Mm-hmm. That's like we say it all the time as if it's a sort of matter-of-fact thing. It's a really big deal. A really big problem. And yet we just say it just falls off the tongue. One party state. Why is it a one party state? Just to sort of, how have we ended up in this situation, do you think?
Well, I think it's worth pointing out geographically, and you're so right. A lot of my friends who live out of state just look at California as being one big blue blob. But really, it is a number of different states combined into one. Mm-hmm. If you look at the state politically and geographically, there's a significant dividing line between coastal California and inland California. There are 58 counties in California, and you could argue that on a typical statewide election, 38 to 40 of those counties will vote for the Republican candidate. Just as the
Republican.
When I ran back in 2014, I won 40 of the 58 counties. Now, of course, the challenge is there are a lot of people that live in those other 18 counties. Right. And there are two major population centers, specifically the Bay Area and Los Angeles, which are where a significant portion of the overall electorate and certainly the Democratic progressive side of the electorate live. And so I think it's more helpful to look at California really as a patchwork, but really divided not north-south, but coastal inland. And I know, Steve, you cover so regularly and poignantly in your shows that there is an elite issue here. And California, even though it's seen as completely a coastal state, even the state has a coastal elite versus the inland. So I think that's an important thing to point out geographically, that there are pockets and large swaths of the state that are generally red.
But in the statewide governance, let's just look at that. The governor, statewide offices, and really importantly, the legislature, because as we're learning about so many issues, that's really where a lot of the policies that affect people's daily lives, it's really all about the legislature in many respects. Mm-hmm. What you haven't seen in recent years, I mean, I'm talking, I don't know, well, you correct me if I'm wrong, at least the last decade, is that typical thing you may get in other units of governance where, it swings back and forth. And there's, one moment the Democrats are popular, then the Republicans are popular, and goes back and forth. And you get a bit of a sense that if, your side may get their turn, the next time around, or maybe into that just doesn't feel realistic in California. Am I wrong? I mean, how long has it been since the Republicans have had power in the legislature?
Well, that goes back to right around the turn of the century. So at least in the legislature, the last statewide Republican governor we had, and this is certainly pertinent to today's politics in California, was, of course, Governor Schwarzenegger, who came into office back in 2003 through the aegis of our last recall effort, won re-election, and served for 7 years. I think that there were some missed opportunities there. He did serve as a Republican governor over a Democrat legislature, but even in that, the split between Democrats and Republicans in the aughts, if you will, was much closer. We've definitely seen in the last decade, and I think particularly when Governor Brown came into office following Schwarzenegger, and certainly now with Governor Newsom, we've seen a real move to the progressive left in our politics and policy, seen both in the legislature and also in the governor's office. And I think that swing is actually being seen in the current recall effort. And where I have hope for the possibility of some swing back to the center is that the recall effort, as much as the Governor Newsom would like to portray this as some Trumpist right-wing conspiracy, is actually comprised of a number of people in the center and center left, and we can get into specifically who those groups and factions are, but showing an exhaustion with this deep blue, highly ideological policy regime we've seen really in the last few years.
Can I jump in? Because one of the things that frustrates me, other than this show, I can't think of many, news outlets that are actually getting out that message, that it actually is, a very unifying event to be recalling this governor. All of the information distribution centers are so far left. And I see nothing but terrible marketing from the right, right? Just responding and always on their heels, responding to this race baiting, a lot of the nonsense, from progressives. And there's not a really clear and distinct message out there from centrists and people who are conservatives saying, this is about crime. This is about schools. This is about, at the end of the day, look, I don't want one party rule anymore. We've had it for so long. We've spent billions of dollars and we have nothing to show for it. Homelessness is at an all-time high. Our energy policies have completely failed. The schools are failing, and enough. So we want something different. But I really don't see that message out there. And until we start controlling more of the information distribution centers, I'm concerned that the reason it stays left is just people are sort of lazy and they're overwhelmed with information. And so incumbents just stay.
Well, I think, again, this is a topic and a theme, that positive populism that Steve covers so well. Yeah. We are beginning to see that in California. And so I just want to put a finer point first to agree with you, Kristen, on how politics in California, especially around the recall, are being perceived. Yes, it's being perceived as this, very kind of right-wing movement, when really it is quite ideologically, politically, class-wise, ethnically wise, racially wise, diverse movement. But if the recall either succeeds or comes close, it won't be the first populist type movement that will shock the world. Yeah. I mean, we have seen that in other instances. And I think the recall, even I would say the recent polling in it shows that it's doubtful that the recall will proceed. But I'll say this: if this is a 52-48 against a recall, but if the vote gets within 5 percentage points, whereas the Republican registration in this state is only a quarter. This really needs to be a message that goes out across.
That's a huge point. It's just such a simple way of thinking about it. We haven't heard it. No one's put it quite like that. Republican registration, 25% of the electorate.
Yep.
Anything above that really is a kind of bonus for those who want to see a kind of across the board coalition for change. Anything. I mean, even if it's 30% for the recall, that's 5% more than just Republicans. And as you say, if you get into the 40s, that's pretty significant.
Well, I'll add to that, Steve, and I think we lose the context of this. Newsom wins in 2018 with one of the greatest landslides in California history.
That's right.
Right. Everybody's talking about the fact that he's 3 steps away from walking into the White House, which, of course, I think Newsom fell out of the crib thinking he was going to be president at some point. But the fact that this particular governor, who came in on such a landslide just 3 years ago, is now on the horns of a recall is really incredible. Right.
Yeah. What was the percentage he got? Remind us.
Oh, my God. It was at around 60%. I mean, he won by 15 or 20 points.
Right.
In a statewide gubernatorial election. And again, for this particular candidate now to have to stand for a recall vote that's qualified, not with all Republican signatures. If this vote is within 5 or 6 points, not only should that send shockwaves across the country, but it also lays out the ground for a future new coalition, political coalition here in the state.
That's really cool. Well, that is really central to what we're trying to do here with this show over the long term and make a contribution to that. I just looked up the numbers. You're right, 61.9% Newsom in that election in 2018, 38.1 for John Cox, the Republican. That is a huge margin.
And what a hopeful message. You're right, Pete, because did you guys see Gavin Newsom saying that the recall effort was just another cancel culture moment? Right. And instead, the way you're casting it, Pete, I really agree with, which is, I sort of didn't think about it this way, which is how incredible that the recall even qualified. Right. Yeah. This is populism. This is democracy in action. It's really inspiring.
Yeah. And again, it's back to your point, Kristen, about the progressive media here. In the early stages of the recall effort, it was always dismissed as, there have been recall attempts, almost every year in the state of California for decades. Yes, but this one actually qualified.
Right.
And again, the fact that it qualified with this particular governor, I think is so significant. And the results, again, even if the recall itself does not succeed, we understand that whatever happens this fall with the recall vote, and the date has not been announced yet, whoever comes out of that, whether a new governor or Newsom makes it through, that person will have to stand for election in 2022, next year. And so, again, whether it's the creation of a new coalition or understanding of that this is not the deep blue state that everybody perceives, that movement is going forward and is going to happen. So, and again, Steve, I think it's important to point out that the reason this is happening in large part is because of the governor's response and the state legislature's response to COVID. I know so many, and you probably do too, Democrats who signed that recall petition, their parents of kids who couldn't get their kids into school, they're small business owners that had their businesses shut down or businesses lost because of the shutdown orders. And this really is a cross-partisan coalition in ways that we've not seen.
I think that's right. Look, I mean, some people I've heard dismiss that and say, well, it's a one-off thing. The pandemic was a one-off thing. And so it doesn't really portend anything long-term about the political situation in the state. And, he may get away with it because things are opening up and so on. Doesn't really mean anything. However, I think there's another way of looking at it, which is all of those frustrations that arose during the pandemic go to deep, long-term structural problems.
That's right.
As Elizabeth Warren might put it, which are caused by these Democrat policies that have been there for years. For example, when you look at the schools, yes, the schools didn't open, but what that highlights is the fact that it's basically run by the teacher unions.
Yes.
When you look at the pain that was suffered by small businesses, I mean, that just highlights the fact that small businesses just have to put up with an increasing array of regulation and so on all the time. And so on. As you go through these issues, you see what a lot of them were just, the pandemic put a spotlight on things that were there anyway. And it's making people really look into that, especially on the schools, I think. People are really, zeroing in on that relationship between the teacher unions and the Democrat politicians in a way that just wasn't the case before.
This is such an important point, Steve, that the schools issue here politically in the state of California cannot be overstated. I think just about every California knows that the reason the governor set June 16th as the so-called reopening date really pulled out of no place, really pulled out of the recall effort. I think everybody acknowledges that he set that date. But June 16th, obviously, as most parents will know, is generally toward the last day of the public school year.
How magical.
I mean, just how does this, come together? And so that connecting point, it's one thing for parents to acknowledge, yes, the teachers unions are very powerful here. They helped get Newsom elected in the first place. That's a whole other story, what went down in 2018, where you had a Democratic candidate and former LA Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa, who ran on an education reform mantra. He lost to Newsom, who ran very much as an affiliate of the teachers unions. It's one thing to understand that the teachers unions get people elected. It's another thing to understand that those leaders that get elected are now beholding to them in ways that are really detrimental. I think we could argue to the lives of our kids and certainly to our homes and what, the experience we've all had as automatic homeschoolers here in California.
So I want to go back, if I may, to the legislature, which I know is, often overlooked because we can focus on it's just simpler and easier to focus on the kind of, just as in national politics, the presidential race rather than Congress and so on. But particularly in California, the legislature really has a huge role on all these policies. The majority now in the assembly, I was just looking that up for the Democrats. It's bigger than the margin in the last gubernatorial election. So right now it says 59 Democrats, 19 Republicans, 1 independent. That's like that's a super, first of all, just for those who haven't heard the term super majority, what does that mean? What's the implication of that?
Well, it basically means that Republican legislators do not have any power in the state. They just show up and, try their best to make public arguments. But when votes come due, they have essentially no political power to shape.
What is is there a specific numerical definition of supermajority? What is that?
It's the 2/3. Once you get 2/3, which is where we're at.
And that means is that because there are rules in the way the assembly works?
Yeah, especially as we look at tax policy, there are particular measures that require 2/3. The majority of measures only need a majority vote, but others will require a 2/3. And Democrats, obviously, in the legislature, in both houses, Senate and Assembly, have those.
They have a supermajority in both.
Right.
A 2/3. That's huge. That's what I want to. I mean. I've been trying to look it up. I haven't been able to get I'm going to waste any more time doing it, so I haven't been able to find it. When's the last time the Republicans controlled either of the chambers in the legislature?
It was in the late 90s. So even when Schwarzenegger was governor, he was overseeing a Democratic legislature. It went to supermajority status during Governor Brown. About 6 or 7 years ago. So
the late 90s. So it's not ancient history,
right?
But it is a long time ago.
Yeah.
So when you made the original point, you were talking about the counties, right? 58 counties,
Yep.
38, 40, something like that, are actually Republican.
Yep.
But in the legislature, it's not done by count. Again, it's a population based. So
That's
you end
it.
up with, right. I mean, what do you think about the prospects for the legislature? Putting aside the recall.
Yep.
I mean, how if you're someone who wants to see change on some of these policy areas, and you know that it's the legislature that's crucial, what's the thing to aim for? For example, I know that there are some who think, and who are actively working on this basis, say, well, look, you're never going to get Republicans elected. They're never going to get a majority, let alone a supermajority. So the hope is that in the way that we do elections now, with the top two in the finishes in the primary going through to the general election, what you really want to support is, for want of a better term, moderate Democrats who will just be better than some of the more ideological Democrats you touched on at the beginning. How do you see it?
Well, I think that's a possible route. But if we were to get up to, say, 5,000 feet and just look at California politics right now, I think what we're seeing within the Democratic coalition is a fracturing along the lines of what I call the beer and pretzel Democrats and the wine and cheese Democrats. To say, the wine and cheese Democrats are very much about identity politics, environmental issues, tend to be highly educated, fairly wealthy, and fairly white, by the way.
Yeah.
The beer and pretzel Democrats tend to be much more private sector union, lower middle class, much more ethnically diverse. And the policy regime that's being put into place, because it's becoming increasingly progressive, we all know the data points of Californians leaving the state. That California just lost its first congressional seat ever. This has sent really, has caused everybody in the state to think, this constant growth, we're the future and all those kinds of things. All of a sudden we're realizing that was one of those little glimpse data points there that you realize.
That was just as a result of the last census.
That's right. That's
losing
right.
a congressional seat at the federal level. Yeah,
that's right. But back to this fracturing that's happening within the Democratic coalition, I firmly believe that there's an opportunity, not so much for a third party, but either for a new Republican coalition, or the Democrats are going to have to find a way to keep those voters and political leaders in their fold, because the environmental policy set of policies around energy supply and costs and housing costs and those kinds of things, those costs are being borne by those in the lower and lower middle classes. And
this is really, this is the absolute, I'm just going, the heart of everything, I think, in politics. It relates to I've been talking about this and writing about it and advocating for it on the national level. Just a couple of observations. First of all, literally your beer and pretzel, wine and cheese, it's hilarious. I've just been reading these books about the Biden campaign. As I say on my Fox shows, I read them so you don't have to. But they are really informative, actually, particularly about what they thought they were doing. And there's a whole set. I don't want to dive into every aspect of that because we try and focus on California here. But one of the things that was really interesting was the Bernie Sanders campaign. When they in the primary, in the national primary, in the presidential primary, were. This is literally a direct quote from one of the I think the top strategists, I can't remember who it was, in the book, in their battle between Bernie and Elizabeth Warren. That's how they described it too. They said their phrase was, well, there's a beer track and a wine track, and the wine people are Elizabeth Warren, and it's kind of highly educated, the professors, people like Elizabeth Warren, and the beer people are Bernie's people. And it's exactly as you say. And what it reminds me of is that back in 2016, when actually Bernie did much better than he did, I guess there wasn't so many candidates. But what was really interesting, I think, about Bernie Sanders in 2016 was that he was pure beer and pretzel, as it were, including, really importantly, on immigration. It was very interesting. And trade, where he still maintained his position. But his positions in 2016 were really aligned with Trump in many respects. And this going to be, the appeal to the working class who have been their interests have been neglected. And then he realized, it seems to me, over the course of, between 2016 and 2020, in the modern Democratic Party, you can't really get anywhere with that kind of politics. And so he completely changed his position, particularly on immigration. Remember, he was the one that Bernie said, well, open borders immigration, that's a Koch brothers proposal. That was his big, we got to, if we've got to look after young American kids who can't get jobs at a decent level. We've got to shut the border, stop low wage immigration. That was 2016. By 2020, he realized he couldn't do that anymore. But he still thought of it like this. And what it reminds me of is the phrase that I've been using a lot, and I think I hadn't really connected it to the California situation, which is that the opportunity for the Republican Party is to build a new multiracial working class coalition. That is the future. And the thing that is interesting about that is that you hear this narrative all the time from the left, amplified in the media, that the Republican Party is dying. Demographics are against the Republican. They're finished. They're old and white and dying out. It's not true, because the working class is bigger than if you add it together, so it's a real political opportunity. And
again, I think it gets to these really two major issues, which are around economic development and jobs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which if you get highly ideological on the environmental issues and business regulation, if you don't want businesses that have smoke coming out of them, people in the middle class work in those jobs, friends. And Californians and the current state of the Democratic Party is very much anti those kinds of jobs. Two major demographics of people have left the state in the last 5 years: those without a college degree, so only a high school degree, and those in the middle class and lower on the economic scale. And that is essentially what we should expect from a wine and cheese policy regime, one that doesn't like industrial types of jobs, and one that frankly is not really focused on the students when it comes to education policy. And I think what we've seen from the pandemic, we're still coming out of the pandemic. As much as the governor wants to talk about California comeback, we're still second or third highest unemployment rate in the country today.
That's right.
As it stands today.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why we're so slow to coming back economically, even with the great engine that is Silicon Valley, is, the unemployment rate, by the way, now I think about it, in Los Angeles is almost 12% in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
And a lot of that has to do with where these lower middle class jobs are not returning. Because of some of the incentives around not coming into work and, the salary support mechanisms that the governor has put into place, but also because of the environmental policies that are going in that make it difficult to own and run those kinds of businesses in California.
And by the way,
40% of small businesses are destroyed. They're not coming back.
Yeah.
So just California alone got decimated. And those are people who are employing, small businesses employ 50% of the W-2 workers in the state. And when you lose 40% of those businesses, of course, it's going to have a dramatic impact. And a lot of what you're talking about, Pete, like these are luxury beliefs. Like I get to sit at home. Isn't the lockdown so nice? I'm going to learn how to cook. I'm going to spend more time with my kids.
Baking. It's all about baking, Kristen.
Baking.
Sourdough.
I know, totally. I missed the boat. But I call them luxury beliefs. They're so arrogant. And it's so wine and cheese to think that the lockdown is a luxury. There was so much suffering amongst the middle income and lower income swaths of our society. And we just completely ignored them. And then we continue to sort of spit in their eye saying, we know what's best for you. Elect us white people to decide what's best for you.
And Kristen, just to be very clear about it, this is a cross-partisan effort here. There are a lot of Democrats who think exactly what you just said is true. I had a conversation with a friend of mine, parents of their kids play with our daughter, and they live in Santa Monica, very much people of the left. And we were just talking about this was probably about 3 or 4 months ago. and talking about when the schools were going to open. They send their kids to public school. And they said, a couple parents who have kids that live in that Santa Monica neighborhood, very much probably upper middle class in this case, but could really only afford a 2-bedroom condo in a place like Santa Monica. Once they realized that their job could be done remote, they moved.
Yeah.
And what we really haven't evaluated at this point is, for those jobs that are remote, how many people actually did leave the state because they could. Mm-hmm. That the only reason that they were being held here under a policy regime that kept schools closed, and you put up with all the different regulations and things that are endemic in California life, that once they can leave, what that's going to mean to the population here in the state.
So I think that what we've got here, and we'll talk about this more. One quick point I wanted to note, by the way, you mentioned a couple of times, Kristen, as well, the environmental stuff, the climate agenda that ends up hurting, in its extreme version, working class people. I totally agree with that. But it's not to say that there isn't a way through that recognizes people want environmental protection, just not in this crazy sort of zealotry of the Green New Deal and so on. You can have, and we're going to talk about this on another podcast, but just one specific example, there are ways to meet our climate goals without decimating industry. For example, why are we closing down nuclear power when that is actually a great way to contribute to emissions reduction? Anyway, so it's not like you're saying we don't care about the environment.
Oh, not at all. Not at all. But I think it does show that there is increasingly a highly ideological view of the environment.
An extremist. It's extreme and it's like a zealotry. It's like,
and frankly, it doesn't contemplate. And I've been in meetings with folks that have this position. They're perfectly happy with people leaving the state. They think we have too many people living in the state. And I wouldn't go so far as maybe to call them anti-human. But frankly, if you were to...
No, I think we can say that. That's fine.
But I mean, if over a glass of wine, of course, or two, you would easily hear that, the fact that we're losing people that that only have a high school degree, that's actually a good thing. They should be going to other places. They don't
so arrogant.
And they would be okay with that. I've spoken with people here, policymakers and activists, that have taken this environmental piece to a place where they say, you know what, we really just have too many people living here in California. That's the real problem. So people have to leave if they can't afford it. If they have to go to Nevada or...
That's right. Get out. Get off to Texas. We don't want you here. Exactly. Yeah. What about the... what I wanted to sort of... to get, we don't have too much time left. I just wanted to sort of check in with you on one thing that I've been dying to ask you for your take on, which is the going back to the political control question. And this really big deficit that Republicans have at the state legislative level. Again, this is something that you hear, and I want to know what you make of it, which is the reason for the collapse in the Republican Party over the last, what you say is the late 90s, since they had control, let's just say the last 3 decades, can be traced back to a very specific thing, which was the support of then Governor, what's his name, Pete Wilson, is it?
That's right. Yep.
For a ballot measure that was perceived to be very hostile to immigrants.
Right.
And he won the ballot measure, but in the process of winning the ballot measure, conveyed to the growing part of California's population that the Republican Party hates you. And that's the real reason for the Republican collapse. Yeah. I hear that a lot. Yeah. What do you make of that argument?
I think there is some truth to this. At the same time, I think it's there are other things that are happening. This was Prop 187, which essentially was a ballot measure that would disallow or prevent the awarding or giving of benefits, social benefits to immigrants here in the state of California. Was perceived as very much of an anti-immigrant, anti-Mexican specifically measure. That's not to say that that perception or that belief or opinion was not present in the Republican Party, or even among others. As you say, the ballot measure did win statewide at the ballot, and those weren't only Republicans who were voting for that measure, but suffice it to say that became acknowledged either in reality or perception, the beginning of the decline of the Republican Party in the state. Now, as someone who's run statewide, but as someone who's run statewide, I agree with those critics of the party that we do need to be, and I think these processes are in place, these coalitions are in place, to be a more ethnically diverse party.
Yeah.
But I also think that if the Democrats had stayed the party of a moderate Democrat, early Jerry Brown, for example, the Republicans would have no chance. The fact of the matter is that the Democrats are not staying in that kind of party. They are becoming increasingly ideological, increasingly beholden to public sector unions in particular. Mm-hmm. And there's a window here. There's a window here for the party that can actually reverse the effects of that Proposition 187 to build that multi-ethnic, racially diverse party based on those principles.
I have to say something funny that you're not going to believe, Steve, but those who went to law school with me know I used to man a table, vote against Prop 187. I was a radical. I was super anti 187. Yeah. Obviously, it impacted my community, and it was perceived as extraordinarily racist. And I'm a young ideologue, and this seemed to fit with my worldview of Republicans are racists, and it's the Democrats who have a heart. And I think that race card has really proven effective to the Democratic Party, right? They've wielded it they've weaponized it extremely effectively. And I think this many years later, I don't know that conservatives have broken free from this, what is indeed a fake narrative, that conservatives harbor some sort of race animus. When you look at their policies, that does not bear out. But there is indeed a marketing problem that we can't seem to overcome, that conservatives are racist. It's just not true, but people still believe it.
I couldn't agree more about that. About both of what you said, the opportunity there to break free of that, and Kristen, the need to break free of that. Again, that's something that we're trying to do here. It's something I've always cared a lot about, and I don't think that there's any reason to feel like this is this kind of barrier weighing down, because that's not how most Republicans today think about stuff. So it feels like that's right. Ancient history. Certainly for me. I mean, I wasn't even. The thing that I wanted to point out, though, is that actually, when you look at the things that affect those kinds of voters today, just looking at it purely politically, just look at what happened in the 2020 election. We saw a really big jump in the Republican vote among Latinos in particular, a significant jump, less big among Black voters, but the Latino vote in California, Latino, obviously much more significant. And the subsequent analysis of that showed that it was driven by what was that increase in Latinos voting for Trump, and it's not just, as is sometimes somewhat disparagingly claimed, it's just the Cubans in Florida or whatever. No, it's Mexican Americans in Texas on the border and throughout the country. Actually.
And here in California too, Steve. There was some really fascinating data work done following the 2020 election, which showed that even in deep blue Los Angeles, highly ethnically diverse, that in almost all of the voting districts, while the uptick was minimal, to be sure, there was actually an uptick in voting for Trump in the 2020 race that was coming out of very ethnically diverse neighborhoods here in California.
And I do think that was ruling class versus regular people.
Yep.
Latinas and Latinos felt like he speaks for us. He understands what we're going through.
Yes. And the analysis, I mean, there's your personal account, and the analysis of the data. This was done by a Democrat pollster. It was a piece in New York Magazine, I think, that brought it to my attention. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. But I felt like it was confirming what I already felt, which was the two main drivers of that really significant increase in the Latino vote for Trump were, one, the perception that the Democrats have gone just completely nuts with this defund the police agenda. So that kind of everything that the Democrats did when they got behind that kind of extremist rhetoric and argument around after the George Floyd protest really hurt them with Latinos. And then the second was the perception that they were against the shutdown thing, that they were against reopening the economy, that they were going to hurt small business and so on. And what's really interesting to me is that both of those trends are really hard for the Democrats to escape from, because their activist base, the fundraising, the donors, the activists, the power centers within the Democratic Party are pushing them more in that direction. It's going to be really hard. I think they're in a trap. They are heading for a real problem here, because it's going to be very hard for them to escape the things that are actually pulling them down among Latino voters. And that's why I think it's actually a really big opportunity here in California for Republicans to just really demonstrate with, as you say, Kristen, with, words and messaging, but also with policies that, no, we're the ones that are on your side and we're going to help you. I think it's not just true and will really make a difference in the real world. It's also politically the way out of this, long-term sort of place in the wilderness that we've been talking about today. I'm really sorry. That's the end of that's all the time we've got. I can't believe it. It feels like that's gone so quickly, and we're going to have lots more to talk about. All of this, Pete, because it's just going to be more and more focused as the recall comes nearer. Yeah. Just time for a quick final thought from both of you, Pete.
Well, I'll just say that I think something you do very well in your show, but Republicans here in the state are going to have to do better in response to the dynamics we talked about. Republicans are not very good with making class-based arguments.
Right.
And Republicans here in California are going to have to get a lot better at that, because the deep blue progressive policy regime is a class-based regime.
Yeah, I love that.
Versus none, but I mean, I think
I'm very happy being a class warrior. I love that. As I point out,
you know, us conservatives, we're not very good at that.
Right? It's really interesting you say that. We really must stop. But I think the thing that I love about that is that. So I get, flying at me the whole time. Well, you talk about the elite and you're in the elite. And yeah, of course I'm in the elite now, but I remember where I came from.
And what policies are supporting, right?
Hungarian immigrants, my parents, working. My stepfather worked construction. He created his own small business. I remember all that. I remember not having money. I remember being poor, working. So I'm very happy being a traitor to my class of the elite that I now find myself in.
Better job at that.
Well said.
Let's leave it there. What a great conversation. Thank you, Pete. We'll see you very soon, I hope, and see all of you at the next episode of California Rebel Base.